Good afternoon, and welcome to the Douglas County Racial and Ethnic Disparities, also known as RED Virtual Conference. My name is LaDonna Jones Dunlap, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Subcommittee. I'd like to give a special thank you to the Separate Juvenile Court of Douglas County, Nebraska, the Honorable Vernon Daniels, also CEO and President of the Urban League of Nebraska, Mr. Thomas Warren Sr., and Douglas County Commissioner Chris Rogers. These individuals provide delivering support to our RED efforts and make our work possible. Additional thank you to the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association Partnership for making this virtual platform possible. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All participants have been placed on mute. If you have a question for our keynote speaker, please enter it into the Q&A box. We will be monitoring questions as they come in, and we'll get to as many as possible at the conclusion of the presentation. For purposes of CEUs, if you are viewing this webinar in a room with others, please make sure to type your name and email address into the chat to receive your certificate. Certificates will be mailed out within a week. During the closing remarks, we ask you to please stay on to complete a short survey. Your input on how we can improve is very important to us. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, we're going to do a quick poll to see who we have with us this afternoon. See, we'll get the poll up here. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Dr. Shawn Ginwright. Dr. Ginwright is the founder and CEO of Flourish Agenda, which is a national nonprofit consulting firm based in Oakland, California. Dr. Ginwright and his team works with youth of color, schools, youth-serving organizations, foundations, and local governments to build and implement strategies that allow young people to flourish. Flourish Agenda is not new to Nebraska, specifically Omaha, Nebraska, as Dr. Ginwright and his team are currently working with several nonprofit agencies here in Omaha, Nebraska to assist with employing strategies on collaboration, communication, and seamless service delivery for nonprofit youth and family-serving agencies in the North Omaha area. As part of that North Omaha team, I have experienced firsthand the energy, compassion, and intentionality of Dr. Ginwright and his Flourish Agenda team. Dr. Ginwright brings forth authenticity and promotes thought-provoking conversations in an effort to bring about a flow to our hustle and to look past our barriers to possibilities. I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Shawn Ginwright.
LaDonna, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank all of Douglas County stakeholders for really focusing on a series of conversations about race and how we could work together to improve racial inequality in our society. As LaDonna mentioned, my name is Dr. Shawn Ginwright. I'm a professor of African American Studies and Education at San Francisco State University, and also the founder and CEO of Flourish Agenda. And she's I've already explained sort of how we work with schools and youth serving agencies around the country, really to transform the systems in ways that have a positive and significant impact on young people and their families. I think I'd like to start today with a little story. I'm sure we have been following the news. We have been really sitting in a space of uncertainty in America. But before we sort of talk about that context, I'd like to share a story that happened to me probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I was asked to come to a prison not far from my home here in California. And I debated whether or not I'd go to the prison, and the invitation read, Dr. Ginwright, we read a book that you wrote about young people in Oakland. We'd love for you to come to the prison to speak with a group of men who are reading your book. And I debated whether or not I would take the invitation and decided to go. And I drove out to the prison, and the prison was about an hour from my home. And they, when I got to the gate, I walked up to the gate, and they said, "Dr. Ginwright, the men that invited you are waiting for you in the cafeteria. Just follow all of the instructions to get to the cafeteria." So she opened the gate, and I walked in, and I was met with another correction officer, and she gave me directions to the cafeteria by asking me to follow these different colored lines on the floor. The first instruction she gave me is, you see the red line? Just follow this red line all the way to the end of the hallway. And I found the red line, and I walked all the way to the end of the corridor where I was met with a door. And that door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked through and it shut behind me, boom. I was met with another correctional officer. I said, "I'm trying to get to the cafeteria." That correctional officer, she said, "Oh, okay, you're going to the cafeteria. See this yellow line? Follow this yellow line all the way to the end of the hallway." So I found the yellow line on the ground, and I walked all the way to the end of the hallway, and was met with a door. That door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked behind it, and it shut behind me, boom. Of course, I was met with another correctional officer, and this correctional officer said, "You're almost to the cafeteria, Dr. Ginwright. You see the blue line on the floor. Just follow this line all the way to the end of the hallway." So I followed that line to the end of the hallway, and you know what happened. The door buzzed open. Bzzz. I walked through it, and it shut behind me. Boom. But this was the third door that I had walked through. And there's something that happened to me inside when that third door shut. I began to feel this sense of enclosure, and I began to feel trapped, and I began to feel closed in, and I began to have a lot of anxiety. I began to worry about, what am I going to tell these men who I was about to speak to? What am I going to tell them? They are incarcerated. They can't feel the warm sun on their face. They can't feel. They can't smell the rain. They can't hug their children. What am I going to tell them about anything? And so I became deeply insecure. And I didn't know what I was going to say. And so as I walked to the cafeteria, they finally opened the double doors to the cafeteria, and I was shocked at what I saw. I had expected 10 men to be waiting for me. And as they opened the door, there were 200 men waiting for me, all in their orange jumpsuits. They came up to me and shook my hand, and one of the brothers said, "Dr. Ginwright, we're so glad you're here. My name is Chris, and I've been here since 1986." And my heart sank. And another young man came up to me. He said, "Hey, my name is George. I'm glad you're here, Dr. Ginwright. We can't wait to hear what you got to say. I've been here since 1990. And one by one, as they came up to me and shook my hand, they said their names and the year they had entered that place. And so I was completely at a loss for words. I was not about to give them a lecture. I wasn't going to talk about theory. I wasn't going to talk to them about the concepts in my book. I didn't know what to say. So as they ushered me to the podium to stand in front of 200 men who were incarcerated in their orange jumpsuits, I did not have a speech. I was speechless. And so rather than speaking from my theory and my training as a professor, I began to speak from my heart. And I just told them how challenging it is to raise an African-American son who is 6'3" in Oakland, because as a parent, I'm concerned for his safety. And I began to tell them about my concerns about my aging parents, and how life doesn't always provide you the lessons that you need to care for your parents. And I just shared what was on my heart. And I just talked for about an hour about what was going on in my life and how that impacted society. And after about an hour of talking, a loud horn came into the auditorium, and it was time for them to go back to their cells. And so they ushered me off the stage, and they were thanking me and shaking my hand. And as I was walking out of the auditorium, I heard a loud voice behind me, "Hey, Dr. G." And I turned around and I was shocked. There was a tall brother. I mean, he was really tall. And I looked up to him, I looked up at him, and he said, "Dr. G, I'm really glad you shared those words. You know, it really touched me. It really made me feel better." And, you began to talk about healing, and you talked about what you're doing in your life and your son. And it reminded me of my own childhood. And when you shared those words with me, Dr. Ginwright, it healed me, because it's hard living in a place like this. And he said, "I was in a fight a couple of years ago," and he leaned down really close to me so that I could see a scar that had come across that was in his face. He said, "They cut me in here, man, because I'm Black, and I'm 6'9", and I'm big. People think I'm a threat. They think I'm always trying to hurt them, man, but I'm not a threat. I'm just a teddy bear, man. It's just, this is the body that I was born in." And he said to me something that I'll never forget. He said that there's something that, he said, "Dr. G, there's something that I do in here every day that provides me some healing." And I'm like, "What is it that you do, man?" And he reached into his pocket, and I got a little nervous. And then he pulled out a little bottle, and he opened up that bottle, and he blew bubbles. And the bubbles floated over my head, and I was suspended in animation for a moment. And then I caught myself, and the first thought was, did this big brother just blow bubbles in my face in prison? Like, what's going on? He said, "These bubbles remind me of when I was a child. It reminds me of a good space in my life. And it heals me when I blow bubbles in here, because this is a hard place to live. There's always something jumping off. There's no love, there's no care, there's no support. So these bubbles remind me when my father used to take me to the park and put me on a swing. And it heals me every time I do that. So thank you for telling me about the importance of healing, Dr. Ginwright." And as I left that afternoon, I began to really think about what he said to me, about what it really means to heal and to have hope and to have well-being in difficult situations. And I think that the lesson that he shared with me is a lesson that I'm sharing with you. That is, we are living through difficult situations. It is not prison, but it's difficult situations. And that if we think and we work together, that we can provide processes of healing for ourselves, for our young people, and for the families that matter so much in our communities. But we also recognize that healing isn't easy, and that we have to begin to think about the context that we're in right now. And that the context that we're in the same way that the prison that he was in, is a challenging context, but one that we can still create processes and create programs that allow for families and children to heal. So what is the context that we're in right now? The context that we're in right now is that we're sitting as a society directly between trauma and transformation. We recognize that the trauma that is a result of COVID, the escalating number of deaths, but not just the medical consequences of COVID, but the political debate and tension over even what COVID is and how to prevent its disease is creating another level of anxiety and uncertainty in our society. And we also know that COVID has revealed ongoing deep racial divisions and racial trauma in our society, that African American and Latinx communities have disproportionately been exposed to COVID. And African American and Latinx communities have experienced gross forms of racial inequality, largely because of the inequality that had existed prior to COVID. COVID just ripped the blanket off of what already had existed. Now we see African American and Latinx communities with disproportionate rates of exposure to COVID, disproportionate rates of hospitalizations, and disproportionate rates of death. And so as we sit as a society between trauma, we recognize the trauma, but we also sit in the possibility of transformation. Our job and our role is to lean into transformation and away from trauma. And just like the man in prison shared with me, that as we move into transformation, we have to move into transformation with the spirit and the strategy of healing. And our role as social workers, and our role as juvenile probation officers, our role as teachers, our role in any work with young people is to move our society into transformation, which makes our jobs the most critical jobs right now. Because if we're not clear about what our role is, we could begin to slip back into trauma. But our role is to create transformation. So we have to understand before we engage in leaning into transformation is where are we and how do we think about trauma in our society? Well, most of us have been trained to think about trauma on the right side of your screen, and that is a medical model. I know my own training in thinking about trauma was a medical model. A medical model of trauma just suggests that we respond to acute acts and events that disrupt normal levels of functioning and behavior. And as a result, we're trained to address and treat issues such as depression, anxiety, panic, compulsive behavior. We treat that with our therapy and our strategies. However, if we move upstream, we begin to see and use another model called a social ecological model to understand the breadth and depth of how trauma occurs. Trauma is not necessarily a single event, but trauma also is a result of social inequality. It's a result of living conditions. It's a result of all the kind of social inequalities that are built and baked into our society. They find themselves in attitudes, in racial bias. They find themselves in institutions such as schools, government, nonprofit organizations, and they find themselves in physical environments such as housing and economic policy. The upstream social ecological model best explains why there's disproportionate representations of exposure to COVID, not the medical model. And so it means that the context that we're in is we have to understand how trauma occurs before we can think about how to respond and treat it. So we have to expand our understanding of the context of trauma. And here's one way we can begin to think about the context of trauma. One of the terms that I was trained to use is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. PTSD is a term that was developed to really describe the behavior of soldiers after they came home from war. They were depressed, they were anxious, they were stressed, nervous, and that there was a disorder that was treated by diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. However, we recognize that in our society that many young people that trauma is not a post experience. That is, they could experience trauma today, they could experience a traumatic event next week, and they could experience it next month. And there's an ongoing exposure to trauma. It is a persistent experience of trauma. But not only that, I've traveled around this country and I've spoken to a lot of young people and a lot of adults who work with young people. And there's a common experience of trauma that we've all experienced. Everyone on this call, all 100 of you right now, when you watched what happened to Mr. Floyd, something shifted inside of you. Something shifted inside of you. Something said that that's not right. We experienced a collective exposure to trauma when we saw what happened to Mr. Floyd. Our collective response to that is to act and to try to change the rules and policies that allowed it to happen in the first place. But that was a collective experience of trauma. When we experienced 9/11, we collectively experienced an act of trauma. And so when we talk about trauma, we can't think of it as an individual event or act. And so a better term that I encourage everyone to use you can continue to use post-traumatic stress disorder, but we also have to use persistent traumatic stress environment. Why do we do that? One, Trauma is a persistent experience for many young people of color and their families. 2, that the disorder doesn't only lie within the individual, but it exists in the broader environment that allowed for trauma to occur in the first place. Therefore, it's in the laws, in the policies, in the condition of the housing, and the condition of schools that allows for trauma to be disproportionately present in communities of color. So PTSE, persistent traumatic stress environment, destigmatizes our exposure to trauma and sees trauma in the upstream. It sees trauma as a persistent process that exists in environments and begs the question of, if persistent traumatic stress exists in the environment, how do we treat it? That is the question we should all be asking. And so we treat individuals, but we also treat the causes, the root causes of trauma in the first place. Here's another way to think about trauma. A researcher by the name of James Garbarino says that when we live and play and work in a persistent traumatic stress environment, it's as if we live in this in a toxic environment, a toxic room. If you think about this image is a picture of a room, my best go at a room that has a lot of physical toxins. If you think about asbestos and lead paint that might be present in your apartment, your home, or your office where you work, if you think about asbestos and lead paint, if you breathe that in over time, that asbestos and lead paint will make you sick. But if you don't go get healed from that illness, from the physical toxins, it can actually become lethal. So we breathe in physical toxins, we get sick, and then we go to the doctor so that we can become well again from our exposures. If we don't go to the doctor and heal from the physical toxins, it can be lethal. James Garbarino says the same thing happens with what he calls social toxicity. And social toxins come from our exposure to persistent traumatic stress environments. Social toxicity are things like uncertainty, shame, fear, stress, disappointment. All of these forms of social toxicity exist in schools, exist in our youth development programs, exist in juvenile probation, and exist in your client load. But oftentimes we're not given the correct diagnosis, and therefore we're given the right tool to respond. So for example, for those of you who are educators in schools, we are oftentimes treating young people's exposure to social toxicity by one tool called discipline and punishment, suspension, expulsion, detention, and believing that response to address the behavior, but not the root cause of the behavior, will actually relieve and address the problem. So when we talk about social toxicity, we have to understand its impact on young people. Here's a model that we can use to think about our exposure to social toxicity. Social toxicity has an impact on young people. It has an impact on adults and families. This is Mia, and Mia is a youth worker. Mia works in, she's a social worker, she's a teacher, but she works with young people of color. And Mia works in a socially toxic environment. And social toxins are like rain clouds. And those rain clouds are formed by things like racism, classism, homophobia, colorism, ageism. All of these isms help form social toxicity. But these social toxicities, like rain, are different than regular rain clouds. Socially toxic rain rains down on all of us and gets inside of us. And sometimes we're unaware of how that socially toxic rain has an impact on our ability to show up for young people. That impact of social toxicity has an influence on Mia at the individual level. It also has an impact on Mia's relationships with young people, her relationships with families, and the relationships that people who she works with at the interpersonal level. That social toxicity doesn't stop there, though. It also has an influence on the institution where Mia works, and that the institution, the toxicity influences the values, the practices, and the policies of that institution. And then the institution produces its own toxicity that goes back out into society, and it reproduces itself. So this is the context of trauma and social toxicity. It has an impact at the individual level. It has an impact in our relationships, but it also has an impact on the institutions where young people find themselves. And so if we were to respond to exposure to trauma, we have to think about trauma occurring at each of these levels and has to be addressed accordingly. And so how do we respond to that? We use the process that's based in research and based in 30 years of sweat working with young people, families, and institutions called healing-centered engagement. Healing-centered engagement builds upon trauma-informed care. It takes trauma-informed care to the next level. And it takes it to the next level because it acknowledges how trauma is experienced collectively, not just individually. As we know that we all, young people experience, you can go to New York, you can go to Chicago, you can go to Los Angeles, or come here to Oakland and talk to young people about their experience with the police. And there's going to be a shared experience that they communicate. Also, it builds upon trauma-informed care because it considers how the root cause of the trauma exists in the environment, not just the individual. It focuses on the restoration and healing rather than coping with symptoms of exposure to trauma. And so when we think about treating trauma, what we usually do is trauma-informed care says we need to treat depression, anxiety, and depression, which is important, but it's different from healing from it. In other words, having a different orientation and using and understanding how that experience can actually make us stronger and more agentive in our work with young people. And lastly, a healing-centered approach is also focused on the support and the work of the adult providers who are working with young people. We know that adults are stressed. We know that adults experience vicarious trauma. We also know that systems such as schools, departments of social work, departments of juvenile probation don't have a very sophisticated way of systems of support for the adult providers. Most of the systems of support is take a sick day, but well-being is not resourced in a way that actually provides guaranteed support for the adult providers. If you've ever been on an airplane, it's been a while for me, and probably you as well because of COVID. But you know, when you're on the plane and the flight attendant comes on and says, you know, should the airplane drop in altitude, these masks will drop down. And if you're with a child, put your mask on first, breathe, and then support the child. Well, this concept of healing-centered engagement, which is about supporting adult providers, is a similar call, suggesting that if you don't take care of the adult, then that adult will not be there for the young person. And so the providing system support for well-being for the adult is significant and important in our thinking about addressing racial inequality and healing from our exposures to racial injustice. So how do we begin to then think about integrating healing-centered engagement in our work? And what practices might we think about? So healing-centered engagement is a process that aligns institutions with a perspective, how we see the issue, an approach, and a strategy that addresses harm and restores well-being. And it supports systems with shifting from thinking about harm and punishment and discipline and confinement to restoration, hope, and healing. If you can think about the man who was in prison, if that prison had a humane practice of having every prisoner blow bubbles or do something that restored their well-being, this healing-centered engagement is a process that helps systems to shift from thinking about only punishment to really restoring the health and well-being of young people and their families. So healing-centered engagement is a non-clinical approach, and it's a strength-based, meaning that we're focusing on the assets of individuals rather than the liabilities, and it advances a holistic view of healing and restores race, culture, and identity as a central feature in our engagement with young people. and well-being. I'll go a little bit into that in just a second. One of the ways that I saw systems shift, and I just wanted to throw this slide in there, is that in New Zealand, earlier this year or late last year, the Prime Minister decided to use well-being as a metric rather than gross national product. And the Prime Minister shifted all the policies, practices of all the institutions, the education system, the juvenile probation system, the social work system, social welfare system, human health and human services system, to focus on the restoration of the well-being of New Zealanders, focused on the Maori, the indigenous people in New Zealand. And I thought that was important because what the Prime Minister highlighted was that in order to focus on well-being and address racial inequality between the New Zealanders and Maori, that you have to focus on two important resources, time and money. And so the entire budget shifted to focus on these metrics that now they're measuring and they're using to determine whether or not their society is progressing towards racial well-being. So healing-centered engagement is political, as I said, rather than clinical. It's rooted in valuing and thinking about culture and identity. And then it's also focusing on the assets we want to create rather than the symptoms we want to eliminate. So how do we do it, and what does it look like in systems? So we use the 5 principles to think about healing-centered engagement. These 5 principles are used to guide, they're guidelines and guide rails that we use to think about integrating healing-centered engagement into our work and addressing racial inequality. Remember that if harm occurs on 3 levels, then we also have to think about healing on those 3 levels. So the first is that we have to think about individual, interpersonal, and institution, that healing happens on those 3 levels. And we use these 5 principles to really think about how and what to do in our organizations and systems. We call them the karma principles. Culture, which is focusing on culture, race, and identity, and having conversations and practices about a reflection on our own race and how our race, our culture, race, and identities influence our work with young people. The research says, number 2, agency. That is that we recognize that we live in difficult and challenging times and situations, but we also have agency to respond to it. So the second principle gives us the capacity to build our own agency as adults, but also work with young people in our systems to have agency and decision-making about the direction of their lives. Third is relationships, and that relationships, there are 2 types of relationships, transactional relationships and transformative relationships. And our goal is to cultivate transformative relationships in our systems. We recognize that transactional relationships are efficient, but they're not enough to actually facilitate healing and well-being. And fourth is meaning. And meaning is really about reminding ourselves about why we're doing the work in the first place. What is the reason that we are social workers? Why did I become a teacher? And sometimes we get into the grind of everyday life that really make it difficult for us to engage in ongoing meaning making about why we're in our work. And then lastly is aspirations. And that is a sense of what we want to accomplish as opposed to what we want to eliminate. I'm going to spend just about 2 or 3 minutes with explaining each of these principles with just a couple of examples. Then I'm going to hopefully provide some steps that you could think about to use in your own work around addressing racial inequality using a healing-centered strategy. First is culture. When we talk about culture, we're really talking about actively engaging young people about conversations about identity. It means sharing your story about identity. It means being clear and introspective about your own racial identity and how your own racial identity may have an impact on influence on your work with young people. It means that we don't assume that our racial identities don't matter. So in our social work practice, in your classrooms, even in juvenile probation, right, in juvenile justice programs, how are we thinking about race, not only in our engagement with young people, but are we tracking race? Are we tracking identity as metrics in our hiring, and who we hire in our organizations? Culture, race, and identity is an important practice that allows us to move into a healing-centered strategy. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is agency. But just as a little drill down, agency is actively building the ability to create change of the root causes of personal and social challenges. And this might mean actively engaging young people in ongoing political education. Agency is important in the research, and the research suggests is that when we collectively experience trauma, one of the things that allows us to heal from that is acting to do something about the trauma we experience. This is why the entire world decided to get off their couch and march when they saw what happened to Mr. Floyd. Because when you marched, when you did something, for those of you who marched, you actually were building a sense of agency, right? The trauma, and then marching and trying to change the laws and rules and policies that actually that make it much more harder for that to happen again. That was an act of agency that contributed to a sense of well-being. The research suggests that when we act in agency, it gives us a sense of control over unperceived, uncontrollable situations. It gives us a sense that we can do something about it. The third is relationships. As I said, transformative relationships is what we need to cultivate. And transformative relationships are those relationships that occur when we're able to share pieces of our humanity, when we're able to share pieces of who we are, when we tell stories about our own experiences. These transformative relationships are durable in that they allow us to have deeper, more meaningful engagement with young people. So when young people come and share stories about their race, or come and share stories about challenges they're facing, transformative relationships gives us the power to listen and to share in ways that provide healing opportunities. I've already talked about meaning. Meaning is when we are able to have a discovery of who we are, right? And create opportunities for young people to define their own assets. And then, of course, we talk about aspirations, right? And aspirations is when we are able to, we're able to begin to work with young people so that they have a future goal orientation. You know, a lot of our work, and I was trained as a sociologist, to study problems. And while problems are important to solve, what aspiration says is that sometimes we actually have to establish goals that are beyond the problems that we want to solve. Problem solving is not the same as possibility creating. And so when we think about aspirations, we think about not just eliminating the deficits or the problems that we see in our society or the problems with young people in their communities, but we actually try to create new opportunities. It's just like the absence of illness doesn't constitute health, just like the absence of violence doesn't constitute peace. The peace and health are entirely different phenomena that's not defined just by the absence of something. What aspirations does is it allows us to push our imagination and work with young people so that they can actually aspire and articulate their goals and objectives. You know, this idea came to me not from research, but from working with young people in a trauma circle here in Oakland. And one night we were talking about, as I was trained in trauma-informed care, we were talking about their trauma and we were mulling over the worst things that happened to them and why those happened. And one of the young men stopped me in the middle of our session with 15 African-American young people. And he said, "Dr. G, why do we always have to talk about our trauma? I am much more than the worst thing that ever happened to me. I want to I want to open up a radio. I want to open up a DJ business, mobile DJ business." And the other young men, when he said that, that resonated with the other young men. And they began to say, "Yeah, man, I want to finish my album, my hip hop album, or I want to open up my own car wash." And they began to talk about their goals and their dreams for their lives. It just so happens that the research says that when you dream and when you imagine and when you develop a sense of future goal orientation, that contributes to hope. And hope is a significant factor in our overall well-being. This is why the man in prison shared his story of bubbles with me, because those bubbles were a form of aspirations that allowed him to be well in difficult situations. I want to just end with these 6 steps that we can think about as we think about healing-centered engagement. Remember that it happens on these 3 levels: individual, interpersonal, and institutional. But the first is to cultivate our own healing practices. There are things that we need to heal from. This idea that we can provide healing and racial healing to those that have to racial healing without our own reflection on our own healing means that we're missing a step. And the second is that we need to develop cohorts of people who are interested in moving and driving a healing-centered practice in your institution. That could be 3 people, it could be 4 people, it could be 10 people. But once you establish that group of people, it means that you begin to develop a sense of, you begin to have conversations just with that group about what healing looks like in your own organization. You build those relationships, and then you begin to do an inventory of policies and practices. And it's simple. What are the policies and practices that harm? What are the policies and practices that actually are restorative? And then you begin to change and pilot test these practices to understand if these practices actually have a positive impact on healing and restoration in your system. I'm going to stop with, I'm just going to share one example. This is an example of a school that happened that's out here in California, where the teacher did not have, most of her school had some exposure to trauma, but the school district didn't have the resources to provide a therapist. And so this teacher this principal decided to take an empty classroom and turn it into a spa. She had trained her teachers, and the students could use this spa. There's diffusers and smell good stuff and lights in there. And so the only instruction is for the students and the teachers, when they go into this spa, is to sit and be quiet. And that's it. And it's a way that everyone in the school can begin to engage in deeper reflection. And then when they come back to their classrooms, they have conversations about what that experience was like. And so she took it upon herself. And even though the school district couldn't provide the kinds of therapists and counselors she needed, she was able to use what she had in order to begin to facilitate a healing-centered environment in their school. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully we can have an opportunity to go to the chat and take some questions about anything that I've covered. So LaDonna?
I'm going to turn that over to Shelley. Thank you, Dr. Ginwright.
Okay.
Actually, I'm going to do it. Sorry, this is Deborah. We do have a couple of questions. If you have further questions, please continue to put them into the chat and we'll get to them as we can. The first one that we received was, how does an agency or institution begin to build a karma model?
Great question. You begin to build a karma model by first you establish a group of people who are interested in using a healing-centered strategy in your institution. If it's just one person, not so much. Even if it's the director or CEO, that's important, but you need a cross-section of people who are interested in building, using those practices. The ideal model is a cross-section of people within an institution or agency. Cross-section is someone working directly with young people. A cross-section might be having a young person themselves. It might also have middle management, and it might have supervisors, and it might also have the CEO or maybe even the board, but it's a small group of people who are interested in those practices in the first place. The second thing is, once you've identified that team, is you actually begin to have conversations about healing and harm. Not theoretically, but what is happening? Do you have data? Do you have surveys? Is there ways that you could look at data about the well-being of folks in your system and institution? Do Do you track your work by racial data? And so that team begins to have conversations about what's happening in the organization and institution. Thirdly, it's important then to do the inventory of practices and policies. And that is, what are the things that are creating harm and what are the things that are actually restorative in our system? And then the last is the pilot and test, which it means that sometimes we think we can do all of this stuff at once. But healing-centered strategy means let's identify one or two policies that we can change to see if, in fact, we can actually create these strategies in our system and organization. Great question. Thanks.
All right, the next one. Actually, we have two. I'm going to kind of combine these together. They're very similar. How do you begin a culture shift with institutions to begin the healing journey? And as culture shifts are difficult, how do you begin a conversation about harm and healing?
Great question. I'm actually going to go back to respond to that question, if it's okay. I want to show the audience this slide because the question, I think, is really important. Let me know, Shelley, if people can see this. Can folks see this? Shelley?
Yes,
Okay.
we can see it, yes.
Okay, your question is how do we actually begin to think about a culture shift in our institution? All of this stuff is great, but like, how does it actually look? Most of the time in our institutions, this is a pyramid that we use in our trainings to actually get organizations to make the shift. Most of the time what we do is we respond to events. We ask what happens and we respond to those events. But the events are only the tip of the iceberg of what's happening in the institution. That means we try to change the policy to actually have greater racial equity, or we change the policy or the rules to make sure we hire a more diverse workforce. But the events are not the actual substantial change because we haven't changed the fundamental values of the institution. The blue line that you see is supposed to be the water line, kind of like an iceberg. And so below the events are what are called patterns, right? And those patterns are trends that we see over time in our institutions, the hiring practices, what young people say. But underneath those patterns are structures. Those are the law, those are policies, those are the policies that make those patterns possible. But underneath those, the structure are mental models. And the mental models are where it's important to begin. And those mental models are those assumptions and values and beliefs that people hold in institutions. Let me give you an example. If we were working in a juvenile probation department, and they wanted to do youth development because they wanted to have a positive climate with working with young people. But we recognized that all of the probation officers in that system were trained, their mental model was young people needed to be punished or young people needed to pay for what they did. That was their mental model. And so they created structures to reinforce their mental model, right? They restricted home visits with their parents. There are patterns. The patterns were how they were interacting and working with young people. There were no healthy relationships. And the events were that young people complained about their interactions with those probation officers. So the point is that you have to start with conversations about the mental models we hold in our institutions. You can change the events, you can change the patterns, and you can actually modify the structures. But if you don't get at the mental models first, then we're not really making the kind of change that's necessary. So systems change is about changing mental models, structures, the patterns, and then we create different kinds of events. Hopefully that helped to answer that really good question.
What barriers, if any, have you encountered with working with agencies, education systems, and nonprofits?
Yeah, great question. The most significant barrier is really getting through the mental models. Again, let me give you another example. So even when we're coming in, many agencies the language they use and the past experiences of trying to make systems change that have not worked are perhaps the most significant barrier. So the example is that one of the things that we ask folks to do is to make these sort of mental model pivots. And one of those pivots is a pivot from problem solving to possibility creating. And that's so hard because we've been trained to see the problem and only address the problem. Another pivot we ask people to make in their mental models is a pivot from hustle to flow. Now, hustle means that we are always on this treadmill, this sort of addiction to frenzy, that things must happen on a time frame, and if it doesn't, we are a failure. This frenzy, addiction to frenzy, means that we all have our to-do list. Everyone on here, all 100 of you or 90 of you have a to-do list probably. And when you complete something off your to-do list, what do? You scratch it off, you put 3 more things back on your to-do list. So there's this ongoing frenzy about how things should get done that makes it much more difficult to be present and to be deliberate about deeper change. So the pivot from hustle to flow is another mental model we encourage people to use. We also talk about mental models about our own racial and ethnic identity, about harm from our racial ethnic identity, about pride from our racial ethnic identity. But we begin with this by shifting the mental models. That is the most difficult and challenging aspect of working with institutions and organizations, is getting the team to actually interrogate their mental models in a way that allows us to scaffold the healing-centered strategy.
Okay. Do you work with youth privately to be sure that they are quote unquote ready to tell their story? Because I have watched kids struggle with this, and it seems to add more trauma if they are not prepared.
Yeah, that's a great question. For 28 years, we still work directly with youth. And so we work with youth and their families, and we use kind of an ecosystem approach because we believe that in order to transform systems, you have to work with systems leaders, you have to work with caregivers, and you have to work with young people themselves. And so every year we have a cohort of young people that we work with through an intense process, an intense summer camp called Camp Akili, where we work with them on their own healing. We also do the same thing with their parents and caregivers because we recognize that trauma is not just relegated to young people, but it's also sits with many of their parents. And then we also work with the systems that they are in. And so we work with teachers and schools and school districts. And so our approach is to try to learn from the young people, learn from parents, work with them, but also use that learning and those lessons to have an influence on the systems that they're a part of.
What work are you doing in the Omaha area as it relates to healing? And is it just for the, and is it just for the nonprofits you're working with, or would this affect the entire community?
Yeah. So, LaDonna, I'll if you want to chime in, I'll talk a little bit about this. We're working with, I think there are 12 organizations in the North Omaha community that primarily are working with African American young people and families. And our work is to bring a healing-centered approach that could be shared amongst those 12 organizations working together, but also using that approach to influence their work with young people and families. And we've been working in North Omaha for about a little over a year. And then actually 4 years ago, we were also in North Omaha working with an organization that transitioned. Shelley, you there?
Yeah, we've got one more question regarding social toxicity. Is this something you believe needs to be taught or trained in the juvenile justice systems, child welfare systems, and explain the benefits of this training?
Yeah. So the answer to that is yes. And here's why. Because, and I'm reflecting on my own training, and to a certain extent, even the training of some of my graduate students over the years. And so, yes, I think it's important that these systems and those be trained in understanding social toxicity, because if we don't understand social toxicity, we tend to treat and respond and work with people as if the challenge of behavior sits with them. In other words, that they are the problem, the parent is the problem, the child is the problem, the young person is the problem, the young person needs discipline, if the adults need to just get a job, right? That means that we focus on the symptom as opposed to focusing on the broader issue, right? It's like if you went to the doctor and you had a sore on your arm or your leg, that was because of some disease, and the doctor said, I'm going to treat your disease by putting a Band-Aid on it because I see a sore here, as opposed to saying this sore that you have on your arm or leg is a symptom of a broader disease that you have in your body. Let's treat that, and if we treat that, we'll also treat the symptom of the sore. And so in a similar way, what social toxicity does is it allows for those who are working with young people to understand what shows up before them, right? And it allows for us to have a broader view about how to respond and support young people in their journey.
Okay, Deb, I think that's your last one. Is that the last one?
Oh, okay. I thought Judge Daniels had a question, but he said he needs to sign off. He had his hand raised. So that looks like that's it.
Okay, well, thanks, Deb. Everybody attending, to let you know, our survey is going to start now. So if you would help us get better by taking a second to answer the questions that are going to appear on the screen, we'd really appreciate that. Dr. Ginwright, thank you so much for spending time with us today and helping us to understand better how we can start the work of beginning to heal our community. I appreciate your story very much at the beginning, reminding us of our humanness and our connection to each other, reminding us of our role in healing our communities and helping to heal our kids and their families. They don't exist independent of their families. The discussion of well-being is so promising, and we appreciate that. We love to hear that. More and more about our kids and families. We know that a lot has happened in our city and in our state here in the last few months, and we are working to better discuss these things as a community and creating a plan to act. We realize that in Omaha, for sure, that we are here at a crossroads of that trauma and transformation that you were telling us about today. And this discussion of the medical model and the social and economic models, as well as those determinants, are so important. In Douglas County, race has been declared a public health issue here. And so helping people gain that understanding of what that means for our ability to get at that well-being for our kids and families is exciting. Also, for the reminder that it is okay to help our kids share dreams and aspirations. They can have a criminal charge and still have dreams and aspire to be something. We were all kids once, and we know the permanent record doesn't really have to exist if we can be there to help intervene for our kids and change their trajectory. So we thank you for your time. We appreciate this information as we start to move forward here. So right about the mental models, and we are very much working here in Douglas County to pivot from hustle to flow for sure. We all know the hustle, but you're right. Sometimes, slow and steady wins the race. And then for everybody watching, just a reminder that tomorrow we have Antonio Fernandez is going to back-to-back red discussions this week, and we will have Antonio Fernandez come to tell us about the importance of those credible messengers in the community. We have to do better at trusting people who don't look like us if we're in charge of agencies and systems, and we have to know that when we do this work and we believe in the capacity of people to change, that we can't then hold that against them later after they've done the things that we've asked them to do, and that they are our gems in our community that can relate to our kids and families and help us bridge the gap of discussion, of being able to talk to each other about some tough stuff. So thank you so much for being here. We very much appreciate it. Everyone have a great day.
Shelley, real quick, Christy let me know that we had a couple of panelists who had their hands raised, but they didn't put their questions in the chat. If it's okay with Dr. Ginwright, we'll unmute those participants and have them talk directly to you. So if you had your hand raised and have a question. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ginwright.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.